traveling, people need healing. Jesus gives instructions, they're healed. God's praised. It gets a little more interesting when only one of the 10 notices that they've been healed and returns. But here again, it's kind of a standard healing story. It might be beneficial to think about how that one leper is different. It seems to be important that he be noticed. Then it said, one of them, when he saw he was healed, turned back. So this story, though it's standard, has lots of preaching points to it, and you could make lots of points. Maybe one point is that we should notice what God is doing, that we should pay attention, and that we should listen. Perhaps the text teaches people to pay attention to what God is doing and to see it and to praise God. Maybe another point is that only one turned back, recognizing Jesus as the source of that healing, the giver of the gift, realizing that God's action had occurred through Jesus. This one goes back to the source of God's intervention for the world. Well, this seems to be important. Equating Jesus with the temple is what some scholars are saying what's going on in this story, because Jesus instructs them to go and show yourself to the priest. That would be there where the lepers would receive a certificate of healing and therefore could return to society. But Jesus grants healing instead. This one leper recognizes where God's power and presence really are. It isn't in the temple. It's in this person, Jesus, and he returns to worship. It's a valid second point. So is the point that we are to see, that we're to perceive, that we're to notice what God is doing in the world, active in our lives, or is it that we are to recognize Jesus as the center of God's action and intervention in the world? Or is it both? Yeah, I guess both are probably valid points. They're good to hear and be reminded of. The leper is the person in whom the correct perception of faith is found and the correct location of the source of that power is found as well. But there's something else about this story, and that if we miss it, we really miss the point. It catches us off guard, and we might not even be able to perceive it, because in the story it's already rich with points and gets us thinking about what is going on in this healing story. The takeaways are far more than enough for any sermon. I think I've given you already 3 points for those of you taking notes. But if we miss this last point, we miss the whole point of the story. It's made using a literary device called priming. If you've ever had to prime a pump, you pump some water into it at the outset and then you get a later outcome. Priming forces the reader's attention in one direction while masking other possibilities, disambiguating contextual signals that are removed by initial information that are highlighted and illustrated, but the point is actually later. It makes the mind stumble. The eyes go back and forth to make sense of the word, to decipher it. Here's a couple of examples. Read these for yourself. Go ahead and move it forward, if you will, Marilee. Next slide. There we go. Oh, go back. Hold on a second. Cinderella sobbed bitterly because she couldn't attend the ball at the palace. There were enormous, what did you want to say? Tears. See how priming works? Forces our mind in one direction so that we begin to interpret later homonyms that might really be moving us in a different direction. The literary technique can be used to great effect by crafting a story so that information is withheld at first. Assumptions are made by the hearer, or in your case, the reader, and then those assumptions are smashed by revealing a new piece of information. Here's another example to read kind of quickly. Did you get tripped up by the word bass? Like in guitar? I think most people do. Their eyes travel back and forth between the word bass or bass and then guitarist on the next line, and you have to take a few takes at it until you can come back and your mind can catch up with what your eyes actually caught. The immediate context is primed, so you think that fishing is the topic, so that the word bass is read and pronounced as a fish, bass. but the word guitar throws you off and you have to come back and look. And then the realization happens that it's a bunch of guitarists who are fishing at the tournament. Our text for the day uses the same technique called priming. And if you don't know the difference between a bass guitar and a smallmouth bass, the point will be lost on you. If you don't know the difference between people who are in the inside and people who are on the outside, then the meaning of this story of Jesus, its true meaning, is really going to be lost on you. It's a great healing story. It's got plenty of points, but it's lost if we miss it because of the priming. The real punchline comes in verse 16. And he was a Samaritan. Bam! As Emerald would say. Only at the end of the healing story does Luke provide us with a narrative aside to his audience, to the momentous fact that the one leper who discerned the correct identity of Jesus and responded appropriately was a foreigner, was an outsider to the promises of Israel. With this identification, Luke sort of pulls the rug out from his original hearers with their prejudgments concerning either who might receive God's benefits or who might correctly identify God's role or Jesus' role in God's divine plan. A leprous Samaritan might be expected to fail under the burdensome weight of wrong ancestry and wrong loyalties and a divine curse, according to the Bible, that has left him on the margins of human interaction in a perpetual state of impurity, a double jeopardy, leper and Samaritan. You can't get much worse than that. If this is Luke's gospel, and Luke's gospel has an interest in universal actions of God. For example, one clue to that is in the genealogies. How many of you feature those biblical genealogies? Love reading those lists of genealogical information. No, you pass by them. But when you pass by Luke's, you do a misservice to yourself. Because instead of starting with Abraham or David, Luke starts with Adam. Jesus, a completely new man, a new human reality. And so this person's request for mercy to Jesus as one who has divine authority, perceived that through Jesus' agency could restore him, is truly the outsider of the outsiders. And it's only him, the one who probably most understands grace, who comes back to give thanks. Jesus, as if to accent the point further, identifies the leper as an outsider, calling him a foreigner, which is a little rough to read over, seems sort of like pejorative. This person, he's saying, is on the outside of being an outsider. And yet, to the most unlikely of persons, God grants mercy, God grants healing, God grants salvation. This most unlikely of persons correctly perceives God's intervention in this life, gets the theology right. This unlikely person falls at Jesus' feet in worship when all the insiders don't. If we read this text and only come away with thinking, one, we should be grateful, not a bad point. Two, that we should notice God's work. I'm reviewing some of these points, by the way, if you're taking notes. Three, that we should identify Jesus as the center of God's intervention in the world. If it's only those three that we've caught, we've missed the point. And all of them are true. All of them are valid points, of course, but we've misread the text if we haven't focused on the end of it, the primed up part that pulls the rug out, that he was an outsider, that he is the least likely to receive healing, grace, and mercy, and yet he becomes first in line. Now, the Bible always sort of pulls the rug out from underneath us if we're reading it right, you know. And Jesus always is sort of challenging our perceptions. He's always blowing our minds. That's kind of what he does. We think we've got him pinned down, and then we read these parables again or these stories, and we get caught off guard, and we realize that we're part of a church that too often makes external markers and puts them in place so that people are kept away from participation in church life. We set up barriers to belonging. What barriers are in our own thinking? Who's on the outside of the outside? What are they to our congregation, these barriers? What are the standards of exclusion that God might want to challenge in this place? Perhaps it would be a good exercise to read the story Samaritan with whomever we would like to exclude. People of color, maybe. A gay man. Or because they don't speak English, or maybe very contemporary, transgendered person. Or maybe we would say, more lively in this conversation is this debate, they're a liberal. Or they're a conservative. Do you see the barriers? Do you see the outsiders of the outsiders? Do you see who's the worst? May we be the one, because there was only one that came back. May we be the one who is grateful for the shocking grace of God in our lives. May we be the one who identifies correctly that Jesus is the source and center of God's intervention in the world. May we be the one who sees that God reaches beyond our biases. God reaches beyond our bigotries. God reaches beyond our exclusion. God reaches beyond our certainties about who is beyond grace, who is lost, who in your opinion is the worst. May you be the one who will join God in such an adventure and journey. God dwells beyond our biases. And God invites us to join him in this action in the world. And may we be the one who lives into the story, who catches all of its points, and in all of its points rejoices with even greater thanksgiving. That we too would go beyond our limitations to push ourselves with the gospel that is good news for everyone. And whoever we don't want the good news to is the growing edge of repentance in our life. That we too would be the one embodying and enacting God's grace to all of God's people, trusting God to search and to save even us and one another. On a day like this when we gather for a healing service, we haven't done a healing service for a while, have we? And if you're new with us, it won't be like Benny Hinn. Not that I have anything against Benny Hinn, I just don't understand him, or where he's coming from, or his Christianity. But it won't be like that. We'll gather together around our community of faith and cry out to God, Kyrie eleison, like these 10 lepers. Lord, have mercy. Maybe somebody in this place feels like they're among the lost of the lost, the outsiders of the outsiders. Maybe because of your station in life, or because of race, or because of the struggle within, or the storm that's going on in your soul, you just can't see yourself as one that's embraced by God's love. But this story tells you that God's gospel, his good news, is universal. It's for absolutely every living thing. It's for every living being. And that would include you, even in your storms. So living out there with God, out in God's radical hospitality, it's in those places where we see real healing begin.